Well, as we continue to talk about just how to handle trials and struggles and tribulations that we all face, we've really come through a lot at this point and just the whole process, which brings us really to the positive side. At this point, we've talked about some of the how to deal with negative things and how to deal with those realities that wage against our soul that is contrary to even what our mind would say, our intellect would understand to be true. We've come back to worship, we've come back to prayer, we've come back to just that confidence and joy that we have in what God has done. And that really has highlighted some choices we have to make, which is why we're now looking at James chapter 1. Last time we looked at Romans and realized one of the purposes for these trials is really just immersing us in the love of God and realizing that we are closest to Him through some of these times of struggle and some of these times of suffering. With that being said, though, there's also a choice that we all have. And in James chapter 1, we see a lot of that, of course, as you know, as he begins, count it all joy in verse 2, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. So that's how he opens up this whole section, speaking of trials and testing, and he goes all the way down. But what's interesting is we have a choice in this. We can count it as all joy, but that very word count it as joy has that idea of a decision. It's an accounting term. It's deciding. It's doing the math on the negative side and on the positive side. I do the math and I realize, hey, I'm ahead on this. I'm going to rejoice. And of course, we know 100-fold, multitude times, the blessing and anything that we have to suffer. But do we do the math? Do we count it all joy? And I point that out because really we're headed to verse 12. And in verse 12, I'd ask you to read in between. I mean, certainly follow that through. And I'm using the ESV here. I think that it does well in translating verse 12, which is a little different than maybe the King James or New King James you might be used to. But either way, it said, blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial. Yours might say temptation, but I think trials is a good rendering here. For when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love him. Now understand that steadfastness is tied to love. We're not going to be able to be steadfast if we don't have that love of God, which is why worship is central to being able to have that strength to endure these kind of trials, to endure temptation, to endure hardship and suffering. So that love of Christ is there, again, back to worship. But the question here today is this word steadfast. Blessed is the man who remains steadfast. Now, that's a choice. And that is something that we pray for God's strength. We commit ourselves in our heart to do the math that we see in verse 2, counting and reckoning these things as better in the long run. And Paul does that in Romans. We see it in chapter 8. I don't count the things, the sufferings of this world, anything compared to the greater weight of glory. Well, that's because he did the math. It's because he chose to. You know, when we get caught in some of these cycles of loss and suffering and trial, it's really easy to just discount anything that is possibly could be good that comes out of this. In fact, we just wall it all away and like, oh, it's terrible. Nothing could good. I mean, really? The God of the universe who creates good out of evil itself can't somehow produce good out of this. You know, it's really faithless. It's really an accusation against him. So here's the question. Now that we've talked about so many of these things and even in our mind, realizing our heart doesn't always follow immediately, where are we? Are we going to choose to submit to the pain and suffering and curl up into a ball? Or are we going to say, God, help me, I want to be steadfast. I want to have that kind of commitment to you that's rooted in your love. And don't ever forget, that love, that worship is the heart of this process. Will you commit to that? Will you commit to that in advance? Will you pray even today, Lord, would you help me be this kind of person as trials enter my life? This is also something that we can help encourage others because let's face it, everyone struggles with these things. We all do. And it might be this message right now and this thought process right now today that God might use to remind you of the opportunity to encourage somebody else. Listen, be steadfast in the Lord, the rock of our salvation, the strong tower in a time of need. If God be for us, who can be against us? Oh, we love this God. We want to serve him, and we are going to stand for him, knowing we've done the math. It really is better with him.